welcome back to the Whiskey Politics Podcast, hosted by Ricochet.com. Still here at the Weekly Standard Cruise, and I'm very pleased to be sitting today with Washington Free Beacon editor, Matt Continetti. Matt, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Pleasure. So I want to kind of jump right into things. First of all, for the purpose of introducing you to our audience, widely considered some of the best reporting on Hillary in the election 2016 comes from you directly and your publication. So wanted to comment on that and thank you for that. In fact, I think you even mentioned in WikiLeaks. Is that correct?
We are mentioned a few times, including one time we're identified as the horrible Washington Free Beacon, which we, of course, take as a badge of honor since it came from the Clinton team.
Wow, that's quite
and we are horrible. We're horrible for the Clintons and for liberals more generally.
Okay, so your approach to the election, and really from the standpoint of journalism as a whole, was really as an investigative arm, as a conservative mouthpiece, and focusing on issues that you felt weren't just being covered in the mainstream press, or?
That's right. When we founded the Washington Free Beacon in 2012, there was a sense that a big weakness on the right was a lack of original, factual, solid reporting, and there was an oversupply of opinion in conservative media, but there was an undersupply of actual reporting. And so we created the Washington Free Beacon with a few rules. One of them was the only editorial to appear on the site would be mine every week. Another was we were going to focus on the left. We figure the Washington Post and the New York Times, and even the news pages of the Wall Street Journal, they got the right covered. You know, you read any of those papers, they're almost all dealing with the right, and Republican politicians and Republican donors scrutinizing them. Where you don't see the same amount of scrutiny, for the most part, is on the left. And so we were going to tackle the left, cover the left the same way that the mainstream media covers the right.
Interesting, and it's certainly needed. So let's talk briefly about the election. Obviously, just coming out, we're about a month outside of the election right here. One of the things that I've noticed that's been a theme for you is that first of all, you were one of the few people that believed Trump could win and would win. And you felt that that was a trend, that was the end of a trend that started with populism that wasn't just of this election cycle, but you felt that it went back decades into the 60s, in fact. Is that...
Right. Well, you can even identify it going back even further, this kind of idea of Jacksonian democracy, right? President Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, leading that first populist revolution in the 1820s, 1830s. This kind of, what makes America different is this populist tendency we have that erupts periodically in our politics. And you also saw it with William Jennings Bryan at the turn of the 20th century. You saw it with Father Coughlin and Huey Long during the Depression, and then, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt kind of took on some aspects of populism when he was president. Then you saw it again in the 60s with Governor Wallace, George Wallace, and you saw it with Ronald Reagan. You see it with Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, Ross Perot, Patrick Buchanan. So Trump is part of a long-standing historical pattern. I always thought he would probably win the Republican nomination. I was, like many people, thought that the odds were in favor of Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. But as we came closer to the election, I thought that the media and the Democrats were growing incredibly overconfident. And even if they followed their tribune, Nate Silver, who I was following, mm-hmm. Even Nate Silver said, look, 35% odds aren't that bad, right? I mean, two out of three times it will go to her, but 1 out of 3 is not that bad. So I put it this way, I was less surprised than many people when things started to turn in Trump's favor around 9 p.m. on election night.
Do you think that's a trend towards populism, and do you believe the GOP are ready to embrace populism more so than ever before with Trump?
No. Populism is a reaction to basically a calcified society and an economy that is not working for middle America. And who is a part of middle America changes, of course, over the centuries. But certainly the economy is not working for the middle American communities in the upper Midwest, in Appalachia, states like West Virginia, Kentucky. And to some degree, you always have that kind of populist spirit as well in the solid South. So one reason Trump was uniquely suited for this election was he doesn't conform to the economic program of the Republican Party. And the economic program of the Republican Party has really not changed for 40 years. And it basically involves pro-business, whatever business wants is right, and upper income tax cuts. That's it. That's all we have to offer. Trump comes along and says, well, look, I'm pro-business. Can't be more pro-business than Donald Trump. But I'm pro-business for American interests and American workers. And so I'm not just going to conform to this internationalist trade policy that's been dogma for the Republican Party since 1992. If we do tax cuts, we're going to do tax cuts for everybody. And if, immigration, which is a key part of our economic policy, has to be made to work for the American worker. Mm-hmm. That we can't continue having a system where we have almost a limitless supply. Indeed, we do have a limitless supply in a global economy of low-skilled labor that you're able to import, and then which will lower the wages of other unskilled, low-skilled workers. So he deviated from the economic program of conservatism in a way that I think made him uniquely qualified and suited to get those Reagan Democrats, those populist Republicans, who are not, they're not country club Republicans, they're Sam's Club Republicans. But he got them to the polls and won.
You've referred to Donald Trump as the honey badger of politics. What does that refer to?
Well, I remember coming across that YouTube video. I'm sure many people have seen it. Right. This is years old now, but the honey badger, the African animal, lives in the savannah and is a wily creature. And it's a video, you can look it up on YouTube, where the honey badger goes through all of these trials and tribulations. And the narrator, after every time that honey badger falls and then gets right up, the narrator says, honey badger don't care. And I think Donald Trump is very similar. Donald Trump don't care. He gets everything thrown at him. He defeated not only one party, but two parties. He had to defeat the Republican Party to get the nomination, and then he went on to defeat the Democratic Party in the election. And yet he still keeps on going. It's a remarkable feat. And one that, of course, leaves many people uncomfortable because you don't really know where it's going to end up.
Not knowing where it ends up has a lot to do with messaging, and a lot of people complained about the media this cycle. For example, I think something that you wrote was that there was actually 35 proposals that Trump put forward, especially to help the inner city communities, and none of that was communicated in the election. Do you believe he has a chance over the next 4 years to increase the African-American turnout in 2020 or and further down the road?
I don't know about turnout. I do think he has a real chance of increasing his support among African-American voters. And I think you see that with his choice of Ben Carson to lead the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And you also see it with his choice of Betsy DeVos to lead the Education Department. DeVos is a very outspoken champion of school choice and charter schools. I even think you see it with his calls for law and order and to cut down on crime. There is also a black silent majority in this country that wants safe streets, not only in the cities, but also in suburbs where many African Americans live. So also important, in addition to all that, and an agenda directed toward that community, and outreach toward it, which Trump did do throughout. The typical Republican says, I'm going to make black outreach by just going to the NAACP. And it happens every cycle. You might remember when Romney did it in 2012. The Republican politician goes there, talks to the NAACP, which is a left-wing organization, and he invariably, the Republican, gets a negative response. Right. And then the black outreach ends. Donald Trump did not talk to the NAACP this year. Instead, he spent many trips going to inner cities, going to black churches, black communities, black schools, and talking to community leaders. Not the national left-wing leaders, but the community leaders who really don't care about partisan politics. They're trying to help their community. I think that outreach will continue, and I think that was one reason why Trump won more black votes than Mitt Romney, and of course the turnout was much lower among African Americans in 2016 than it was in 2012, which was a sign, kind of a passive sign, that there was not a dime's worth of difference between those two candidates, and if Donald Trump won, all right.
It's an interesting thing, and certainly from a historical standpoint, it certainly can open the door. for
well,
future
you know, a lot of
development.
people care about jobs, right? But one
That's what it boils down to.
one of the problems with the Republican Party is exactly that economic agenda. I talk about, you know, you have an economic agenda suited to corporate America, and then you wake up after every election to wonder why you lost. It's because most of America does not like corporate America.
Right.
They look at corporate America as in for itself. So Donald Trump comes along and says, my economic agenda is like, corporations would go to benefit from it because they're going to get tax reform, for example. We're going to make a pro-business environment, fewer regulations, deals like you saw with Carrier. But my interest is with the worker. And it doesn't matter whether that worker is white or black or Hispanic or Asian. It's for the worker. And if you make that argument in those terms, I think you do have the basis for much wider support among the whole of the American population 4 years from now.
One of the most oft-repeated phrases during the election was "drain the swamp." A lot of people relate that to bureaucracy and paring down the waste and such. A lot of other people, however, and I think you've fallen into this camp, believe that it may actually relate more to a bigger picture, a global picture, even foreign policy. And some of the decisions that have been made over the past 8 years, especially when it comes to Iran and Israel and ISIS, and obviously we have a resurgence now in Al-Qaeda. Do you believe that, or let me ask you another way, do you have confidence in Trump when it comes to foreign policy and that the world will become a safer place? Or is this, I mean, there's a lot of scared folks right now.
Well, I think the world is a very dangerous place, and I think one of the reasons the world is a dangerous place is nations no longer respect the United States of America. Our adversaries no longer fear the United States, and our allies no longer trust us. And that is the result of 8 years of Barack Obama, who, of course, if you think about the Obama doctrine, it was leading from behind, right? And also reaching out the open hand to America's enemies, whether that was Fidel Castro's Cuba or whether it was the Ayatollah in Iran. With Donald Trump, we're going to have a very different foreign policy. The word he used in the campaign was America first. What that means is it's going to be narrowly tailored to America's interests, national security interests. And it's not going to be politically correct because, of course, remember one of the reasons Trump won the Republican nomination, and it didn't hurt him to the degree where he would lose in the general election, was the so-called Muslim ban, which in effect means reducing immigration or suspending immigration from countries that are tied to terrorism. So that's definitely politically incorrect. But I think it falls under his category of America first. Another aspect of it is his relationship with Russia. He was criticized, of course, by many people on both sides of the aisle throughout the campaign for saying kind things about Vladimir Putin and wanting a new Russia relationship. We'll see how that works out in practice, but what I think the idea behind it is Trump does not care about what happens inside other countries. If they're going to work with us on trade deals and national security, he does not care about what goes on inside that other country, which is a real difference from the last 16 years of American foreign policy under Presidents Bush and Obama, where you did have this kind of which is also an American tradition, a universalizing the American principles and saying, you know, all countries need to conform to our ideas about liberty and equality. That ends with Trump. America first means he's looking out for the United States, and he doesn't care what the other countries do internally as long as they are working with us externally.
And how will that lead to the relationship with Israel? Obviously, there's been somewhat of a, I would say, a friction between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Obama. I was in Israel recently, and by and large, there's tremendous support for whoever was going to be on the GOP ticket. They felt that they have been abandoned in many ways, especially when it came to the Iran deal. Do you, with obviously the cabinet that's being put into place, and Trump's philosophy, do you believe that that relationship will strengthen now? Is there confidence in that?
Well, the two guys at the top of the ticket and the cabinet are President-elect Donald Trump and Vice President-elect Mike Pence, and both are stalwart supporters of the State of Israel. And one of Trump's first foreign policy addresses was his speech to AIPAC in this spring. And he made some core promises there, including moving the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And some people were skeptical. Even the pro-Israel community was skeptical whether he would fulfill that promise. But I have to tell you, he's shaken things up so much, even before he's become president. I kind of say to myself, he probably will move that darn embassy. He just doesn't care. He's the honey badger, right?
Right.
So,
right.
Other aspects of it include tougher stance to Iran, really upholding the Iran deal, if not vacating it. Of course, it's hard to see that it's probably going to fall apart on its own weight. But I also think you're going to have an approach to Israel's internal problems with, say, the Palestinians and Hamas that would be America first, in the sense that Trump is not going to spend a lot of time worrying about a final settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, especially at a moment now where one is just, so totally out of reach.
So we're halfway through the Weekly Standard cruise. We're in the middle of the ocean. The only news that we're able to get here is filtered news through the New York Times on a newspaper every morning. And one of the headlines this morning is that President Rouhani of Iran has suggested that President Trump will not be able to tear up the Iran agreement. And it was met with death to USA in the stands, literally. This was reported in the New York Times. So where are we with that? It's not a treaty. It kind of sort of is. And what options does Trump have with this?
Well, with Trump's view of negotiations and deals is that each side gives up something. Mm-hmm. And one of his big criticisms of the Iran deal is that Iran didn't give up anything. It was all the United States. And of course, not only did we give them the $150 billion, but at the end of the agreement, the decade, Iran can immediately construct a nuclear weapon if it wanted to.
Right.
It can immediately ratchet up to nuclear status. So what does that mean? Well, I think General Mattis, his selection as Secretary of Defense, is going to tell him, you have to expand the strategic space. The Iran deal, it's a mess. We've already fulfilled our obligations. People are going to test, the United Nations is going to inspect or whatever. We have to make things more difficult for Iran, not necessarily in terms of the deal, which is done, but more globally. So look at the things that the Iran deal did not address: missile development, cyber attacks, militias, and I think most importantly, and what we'll probably see very soon, is these swift boats that come up and harass our ships.
Right.
In all those areas, you're going to have much tougher stances from President Trump.
Right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much. We've been enjoying the panels this week, and certainly your reading, and looking forward to continuing reading publication for many, many years to come. So I want to thank you for taking the time, and we're looking forward to it in the future. Thank you very much, Matt.